You say your emotions control you. Anger, anxiety, desire, jealousy, the sudden surge of something hot and irrational that moves through you before you have time to choose otherwise. And you believe, most sincerely, that this is the problem. That if only you could quiet those feelings, if only you could become harder, colder, more disciplined, you would finally be free. But I will tell you something more disturbing than the emotions themselves. It is not your emotions that control you. It is what you refuse to see about yourself. And that distinction, small as it may sound, changes everything. Because if emotions were the enemy, then suppressing them would be the solution. And most people have tried that. Most people have tried to silence the anger, bury the anxiety, override the jealousy with willpower and self-criticism. And most people have discovered quietly and repeatedly that it does not work. The feeling comes back, often stronger, often at a worse moment, often aimed at someone who barely deserved it. This is not weakness. This is something far more interesting and far more structural. What I want to explain to you is not how to stop feeling. That is not possible, and it would not be desirable if it were. What I want to show you is the mechanism underneath, the pattern that makes your emotional life feel like something happening to you rather than something happening in you. Because here is the truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You are not losing control. You are following a script, and the script was written long before today. Let us begin with something very ordinary, something you have almost certainly done, or witnessed, or recognized in someone you know well. A man is driving. Traffic is slow. Another driver cuts in front of him without signaling, and suddenly, in less than a second, he is furious. Not mildly irritated, furious. His hands tighten on the wheel, his face changes, he mutters or shouts or gestures. And then, perhaps 20 minutes later, he is perfectly calm again, sitting at his desk, wondering vaguely why he let it affect him so much. What happened there? The common explanation is simple. The other driver was rude. Rudeness produces anger. That is just how emotions work. But notice what that explanation skips entirely. It skips the speed. The anger arrived before he had consciously processed anything. Before he had decided to be angry, he already was. The emotion did not follow from a deliberate judgment. It preceded one, and it skips the intensity. The offense was minor, a few seconds of inconvenience on a road he will forget by evening. But the response was wildly disproportionate, not because the event was significant, but because something inside him was already primed to react that way. This is what I mean when I say most people are not reacting. They are repeating. There is a mechanism at work here that modern science has spent considerable effort confirming, and that I suspected long before it was confirmed. Emotional responses become patterns. They are shaped by repetition, by the same cue triggering the same response so many times that the response becomes automatic, instantaneous. The thinking mind barely gets a vote. Ask yourself, how many times in his life has that man felt disrespected? How many times has he encountered someone who cut ahead of him, ignored his presence, dismissed him? Not just on roads, in offices, in families, in the slow accumulation of ordinary social life. Every repetition carved the groove deeper. Every time that pattern completed, offense felt, anger released, situation passed, the nervous system learned, this is how we respond to this. And eventually, the response became reflexive, not chosen, automatic. You are not angry at the driver. You are replaying a pattern that has been running in you for years, perhaps decades, and today's driver simply had the misfortune of activating it. This is the first thing to understand. Your emotional reactions are not fresh responses to present events. They are habitual responses triggered by present events. The event is new, the reaction is old. But there is another layer here, and it is the one that most people resist most strongly. Because when I speak about anger, about the speed and intensity of it, you might think I am describing only temperamental people, people with obvious problems, people who are visibly reactive. But I am not. I am describing something that operates in almost every person, in almost every emotional domain, including the ones that look perfectly reasonable. Think about the person who becomes inexplicably tense in certain conversations at work. Not angry, just tense, closed, defensive. They say nothing particularly wrong, but something about them shifts when certain topics arise, or when certain people are in the room. Ask them why, and they probably cannot tell you. They might say they just don't trust that person, or the situation feels off. But the reaction was there before the explanation. Think about the person who, whenever someone close to them is praised, feels something uncomfortable. Not envy exactly, or not what they would call envy, more like a quiet deflation, a small withdrawal. They recover quickly and say the right things, but the moment was there. Something moved in them that they did not choose. Think about the person who, when asked for help, immediately feels burdened, before they even know what is being asked. The request has barely arrived, and the heaviness is already there. In each case, an automatic response. A pattern so well rehearsed it runs before the conscious mind arrives. And this raises a much sharper question. If these responses are automatic, if they arrive before thought, then what exactly is the person controlling when they believe they are in control of their emotions? The answer for most people is this: they are not controlling their emotions, they are managing their expressions of them. That is a very different thing. And confusing the two is one of the most consequential errors a person can make. Managing expression means learning when it is socially appropriate to show what you feel. Keeping the voice calm in a meeting, even when something stings. Smiling at a family gathering while carrying something heavy. Waiting until you are alone to feel what you could not feel in public. This is what most people call emotional control. And in a narrow social sense, it works. It keeps the surface smooth. But underneath the surface, nothing has changed. The reaction still happened. The pattern still fired. The feeling, suppressed now, redirected now, continues looking for an exit. And it often finds one in a different place, at a different time, aimed at a different person who deserved it far less. You avoid saying something sharp to your employer, and then that evening say something sharp to someone at home. You hold your composure through a tense conversation, and then lie awake for 2 hours afterward, replaying the whole exchange. You press the anger down and it becomes irritability. You press the anxiety down and it becomes something that sits in the chest without a name. Here is what the research has confirmed, plainly and consistently. Suppression does not reduce emotional intensity. In many cases, it increases it. The more you try to silence an emotion, the more psychic energy you spend maintaining that silence, and the more volatile the emotion becomes beneath it. This is not a personal failing. It is a structural feature of how the mind works. And it points to something I observed very early in my clinical work and have never had reason to revise. The emotion you refuse to acknowledge does not disappear. It goes underground. And underground, without examination, without light, it grows more powerful than it ever was on the surface. But now I want to show you something more interesting than suppression. Because even when people do not suppress, even when they allow themselves to feel and to react, there is still a mechanism operating that most people never examine. It has to do with what the emotion is actually defending. When someone loses their temper at a minor provocation, when the anger is faster and hotter than the situation seems to justify, it is almost never really about the situation. The situation is a trigger. What the emotion is defending is something far more personal. Consider the man who becomes furious when a colleague disagrees with him publicly. The disagreement itself is small. The colleague has done nothing cruel. But the reaction is immediate, disproportionate, and lingers for hours. What is actually happening? He is not angry because his colleague is wrong. He may be angry because being challenged in public activated something in him that he cannot quite name, a sense of being diminished, of being seen as less capable, of not being taken seriously. And that feeling, however brief, was intolerable, not because of what happened today, but because he has spent considerable energy constructing an image of himself as someone competent, respected, and authoritative. And when that image was threatened, even lightly, even briefly, his mind reacted as if something vital was under attack, which, in a psychological sense, it was. The self-image is not a trivial thing. People protect it with extraordinary energy. They distort their perceptions around it. They rewrite their memories to accommodate it. They avoid information that contradicts it. And they react, often very strongly, when external events threaten to make it unstable. This is what I mean when I say, you are not angry at them. You are protecting who you believe you are. Let me make this concrete in a different way, because I think this is the part that most people have the hardest time accepting. Imagine a person who considers herself patient, generous, not someone who holds grudges. She genuinely believes this. Her social identity is partly organized around it. And then something happens. A close friend makes a dismissive comment, something small, something the friend has probably forgotten by the following day. But this woman cannot forget it. She says nothing. She keeps her voice warm. She maintains the relationship exactly as before on the surface. But something has changed. She is slightly less available. Her responses take a little longer. When the friend asks for her time, she finds reasons to be busy. And if you asked her why, if you carefully pointed out this pattern, she would most likely say she wasn't sure, or that things had just been hectic, or that the friendship had simply changed. She would not say, I felt hurt, and then I felt angry, and then I felt that anger was incompatible with how I see myself, so I suppressed it, and now it is expressing itself through withdrawal, which I have successfully told myself is simply being busy. She would not say that, not because she is dishonest, but because she genuinely does not see it. This is the thing about defense mechanisms that most people misunderstand. They are not lies you consciously tell yourself. They are the mind's automatic way of protecting its inner organization from information that would disrupt it. Projection, rationalization, denial. These are not character flaws. They are operations. The mind performing them is not weak or dishonest. It is simply running a program it learned long ago. A program whose purpose is to keep the conscious self-image intact at any cost. And the cost, over time, is considerable. Because here is the quiet devastation that follows. When the mind is busy defending the self-image from uncomfortable truths, it is not examining them. It is not learning from them. It is not adjusting. And so the same patterns, the same automatic reactions, the same disproportionate responses, the same moments of inexplicable bitterness or withdrawal or sudden heat, repeat, month after month, year after year. The argument in a marriage that happens over different words every few months, but is structurally identical every time. The relationship that ends the same way as the previous one, for reasons the person explains to themselves very differently each time. The pattern of overreaction at work that costs someone an opportunity, followed by a period of relative calm, followed eventually by another overreaction. I observed this so consistently that I gave it a name: repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate emotionally, again and again, situations that echo unresolved experiences from the past, not consciously, not deliberately, but as if some part of the person is returning to an old wound, not to reopen it, but because some older part of the mind is still trying to master it, still trying to resolve something that was never resolved. You have almost certainly seen this, perhaps in someone else, perhaps, if you are honest, in yourself. The person who repeatedly ends up in relationships with people who are emotionally unavailable, who keeps trying, each time with someone new, with renewed hope, and keeps arriving at the same place. The person who consistently chooses work environments or authority figures that recreate the conditions of a difficult early relationship, and who responds to those environments with emotions that seem, to outside observers, oddly intense for what is actually happening. They are not reacting to what is happening, they are reacting to what it means to them, and what it means to them is shaped not by the present moment, but by the long history they carry into it. This brings me to something I want you to think about carefully. Most people believe that emotions give them accurate information about the world, that if they feel angry, it is because something unjust is occurring. If they feel anxious, it is because something is genuinely threatening. If they feel hurt, the hurt is proportionate to what was done. But here is the problem with that belief. Your emotions do not respond to events. They respond to your interpretation of events. And your interpretations are shaped, profoundly, invisibly, by your history, your identity, your fears, your accumulated patterns. You do not feel what is happening. You feel what it means to you. Think about two people who receive the same piece of criticism from the same person on the same day. One of them feels briefly stung, considers whether the criticism has merit, and moves on. The other is derailed for hours, churning over it, constructing responses, feeling a low-level heat that colors the rest of the day. The event was identical. The emotional experience was not. Not because one person is stronger than the other, but because they are interpreting the same external event through entirely different internal lenses. The person who is derailed is not being controlled by the criticism. They are being controlled by what the criticism activated, a particular self-concept, a particular vulnerability, a particular interpretation that transformed a piece of feedback into something that felt like an attack on their worth. And once you understand that, the question of emotional control changes entirely. Because the question is no longer, how do I suppress this feeling? The question becomes, what is this feeling actually responding to? What have I interpreted here, and why does that interpretation carry so much weight? Let me introduce an analogy here, because I think it makes the mechanism easier to hold in mind. Think of emotions as alarms. An alarm does not know whether there is a real fire or whether the toast is burning. It does not discriminate. It simply responds to the signal it was calibrated to detect. And if the alarm is miscalibrated, if it was set long ago to respond to signals that were genuinely dangerous then, but are not dangerous now, it will continue firing even when nothing is actually wrong. The man who becomes furious at minor disrespect on the road has, in effect, a very sensitive alarm for situations involving dismissal. Perhaps that sensitivity served him at some point. Perhaps in an earlier environment, a family, a school, a formative experience, being dismissed had real consequences, and reacting sharply was the only available protection. But the alarm does not automatically recalibrate when the environment changes. It keeps firing at the old threshold, in new contexts, at people who do not deserve the full force of what it releases. This is what people mean when they say someone has a short temper, or that someone overreacts. They are not identifying a character flaw. They are observing an alarm system that was calibrated for a different situation and has never been adjusted. And the only way to adjust it is not to muffle it, not to pretend it is not going off. The only way to adjust it is to examine it, to ask, what is this alarm actually responding to? When was it calibrated? Is that calibration still accurate? But here is where the most unsettling part of all this arrives. Most people do not want to ask those questions, not because they are unintelligent, not because they lack the capacity for self-examination, but because the answers are uncomfortable. Because genuinely examining the pattern, tracing the automatic reaction back to its origin, seeing what it is really defending, requires confronting things about yourself that your mind has been working very hard to keep you from having to confront. The man whose identity is organized around being respected does not want to ask why disrespect is so activating for him, because following that question honestly might lead him somewhere he has been carefully avoiding, toward a time or a relationship or a long series of experiences in which he genuinely was powerless and genuinely was not respected, and in which the only available response was to feel it in silence. The woman who cannot stop repeating the same relational pattern does not necessarily want to see the structure of it clearly, because seeing it clearly would require relinquishing the explanation she has constructed, that she simply keeps meeting the wrong people, that circumstances are against her, that the other person is always the problem, and replacing it with something more difficult to hold. This is the deepest function of defense mechanisms. They are not just protecting the self-image, they are protecting the person from the pain of really seeing themselves. And the tragic irony is this: the protection that keeps the pain away also keeps the pattern in place. Now, I want to address directly something that many people believe, because I hear it often, and it is deeply mistaken. People say, strong people do not feel emotions. They are disciplined, unmoved, cold if necessary, and that coldness is strength. This is almost exactly backwards. What we call emotional strength is not the absence of feeling. It is not hardness. It is not the performance of calm. Emotional strength is the capacity to feel something, to allow it to be present, to know what it is, to understand what it is responding to, without being driven by it into automatic behavior. The person who suppresses anger entirely and never allows themselves to feel it is not stronger than the person who feels anger intensely. They are in many ways more vulnerable, because the suppressed emotion does not vanish, it reorganizes, it finds indirect expression in bitterness, in cynicism, in contempt for people who show what they feel, in a body that accumulates what the mind refuses to carry consciously. What you repress does not go away, it goes into the dark and waits. And in the dark, without examination, without exposure to reality, it tends to grow larger than it actually is. An anger that is examined and understood tends to diminish. An anger that is suppressed and never examined tends to become something more corrosive over time: resentment, or withdrawal, or a general flatness that people mistake for maturity. Maturity is not the death of feeling. Maturity is the development of the capacity to know what you feel without being swept away by it. There is one more misconception I want to examine directly, because it is perhaps the one most responsible for keeping people stuck. People say, I just have a short temper. I'm just an anxious person. I have always been this way. Listen to the structure of that statement. It locates the pattern in identity. It frames what is actually a learned, habitual response as a fixed personal characteristic. And once something is framed as fixed, as simply who you are, there is no reason to examine it, because examination implies the possibility of change, and you have already told yourself there is none. But a short temper is not a personality, it is a habit. Anxiety is not an identity. It is a learned pattern of response to perceived threat, a pattern shaped by experience, by early conditions, by thousands of repetitions of the same cue and the same response. Habits can be examined. Patterns can be understood. Understanding, genuine understanding, is not merely intellectual. When you truly see the mechanism, when you trace the automatic reaction back through its history to what it was originally responding to, and you see that the situation it was built for no longer exists in the same form, something shifts. Not instantly, not through a single revelation. The groove carved by years of repetition does not fill in overnight. But the automatic quality, the sense of having no choice, of being swept up, begins to loosen. Because you are no longer just inside the pattern, you are watching it, and those are not the same position. Let me tell you what I believe is actually happening in the moments when people feel most controlled by their emotions. You do not feel what is happening. You feel what it means to you. And what it means to you is a function of who you have decided you are, what you have learned to fear, what wounds have never been properly examined, and what patterns have been running in you for so long that you have stopped noticing them as patterns and have started experiencing them as reality. The anger that arrives in 1 second, that was shaped over many years. The anxiety that wakes you at 3 in the morning and attaches itself to whatever problem is available, that is not really about the problem. The bitterness that surfaces in small moments, in traffic, in a sarcastic comment, in a quick deflation when someone else succeeds, that is not about those small moments. These are signals, not commands. They are the mind reporting on something internal. And the question is whether you will treat them as information to be understood or as states to be endured and then suppressed. Most people choose endurance and suppression because it is faster, because it does not require anything uncomfortable from them, because examining the pattern means at some point sitting with the discomfort of seeing yourself clearly. Not the self-image, not the story, but the actual structure of how you have been responding to life. That is a harder thing than suppressing an emotion. It is a harder thing than gritting your teeth and saying nothing in the moment. But it is the only thing that actually changes anything. Here is how I would summarize what I have tried to show you. You do not lose control of your emotions. You follow patterns that were established long before the present moment, triggered by present events, shaped by a history you may not have fully examined, and defended by a mind that is very skilled at protecting you from having to see the pattern clearly. The emotions are not the enemy. The refusal to examine what the emotions are actually responding to, that is what keeps people stuck. The goal is not suppression. Suppression strengthens what it presses down. The goal is not the performance of calm. Performance is not transformation. The goal is understanding, real understanding, not intellectual recognition, but the kind that comes from actually sitting with the mechanism, tracing the reaction backward, asking the honest question, what is this really about? When did this pattern begin? What am I actually defending here? And then, which is perhaps the most important part, the capacity to observe the emotion without becoming it, to feel what arises without immediately acting from it, to create, in the space between the trigger and the response, a moment of awareness. That space is small at first. Sometimes it is barely there. But that space is where everything that matters actually lives. You think emotions control you, and they do, but not in the way you think. They do not control you because they are powerful. Emotion is simply information the body generates in response to what it perceives. They control you because the patterns beneath them are invisible, because the mechanisms are automatic, because the mind is very good at hiding from itself the most important things about how it actually operates. And what you cannot see, you cannot change. Not because change is impossible, but because you cannot choose a different path from the one you are already on if you have never stopped to see where the current path is actually going. The question is not, how do I feel less? The question is, what have I been avoiding seeing, and what has that avoidance been costing me? That question, asked honestly, is where understanding begins. And understanding, in my experience, is the only force capable of loosening what habit and defense and unexamined history have locked in place. The pattern is not you, but until you examine it, it will run your life as if it were.